this is not yet my finished bed setup, but we're gonna nevertheless embark on a very quick Q&A. Our first question is Byrne, and Byrne says, I've been reading Solzhenitsyn since the 70s, but near the end of his life I noticed that he had some kind of support for Putin, and he made statements about Putin, Russia, Ukraine. I consider him one of the greatest writers. But how can we understand his latter-day sentiments? Naivete, turned toward the hard right, seduction, being out of touch. What do you think? I am not a Solzhenitsyn expert, but it's important to put a couple of things on the table. And I think you're going to know everything I say, but for the benefit of the audience, it might be helpful. You know, a colleague of mine has a story he likes to tell about speaking to a Sovietologist still during the Cold War period. And the Sovietologist said, look, Solzhenitsyn illustrates the liberal strand in Russian culture. And that colleague, in response to that exchange, said to himself, jokingly, I'm never going to speak to Sovietologists again. So that really means that you can't conclude from Solzhenitsyn's vehement anti-Soviet, vehement anti-totalitarian position that he is pro-Western, or he is pro-liberal. Nothing of the sort follows. In fact, Solzhenitsyn was very critical of the West already during the Soviet period. He was critical of the West both for mimicking certain pathologies that Solzhenitsyn noticed in the Soviet Union, but also for not coming to terms and understanding the horrors of the Soviet experiment. And then on top of that, you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was the site of another experiment in Western utopia that mortified Solzhenitsyn. And this time it was an experiment in a certain kind of neoliberal utopia. Now, I typically recommend people not to use the term neoliberal unless you use it as a term of art, and I'm using it as a term of art. My everyday definition of neoliberalism is being committed to the primacy of the market in a magical, dreamy way. So if you are committed to the primacy of the market in a systematic, ideological way, you're not a neoliberal. So neoliberalism is not an actual position. It's a kind of globally persistent political pathology. Anyway, but that kind of neoliberal experiment that took place on that ex-Soviet space mortified Solzhenitsyn. He thought, look, we're getting more of this nonsense. And this is all based on this disastrous Western thinking that, mimicking Solzhenitsyn here, that as long as you do nothing, Fukuyama-style Western ideas will prevail. Well, what a disaster. And then Solzhenitsyn was mortified by certain Western interventions, including in Yugoslavia, which he very much rejected. And it's ironic, yes, that at the end he came to have sympathies for the Putin regime and some hope around the Putin regime, even though the Putin regime in the end embarked on totalitarianism as one of its destinations. And even though it's a regime devoid of ideas, or at least devoid of ideological ideas, it's not devoid of mystical sort of currencies, but it's devoid of ideas, and that's an anti-Solzhenitsyn position, whatever you think of Solzhenitsyn and however highly you rate him. But I do think that we should evaluate him on whatever our view is of the cumulative contribution of his career, not on this later turn. Jörn asks, Kamil Galeev argues that breaking a treaty is not a sign of dishonesty for Putin, but that it is honorable. Would you agree with this? And if that's so, how can there ever be peace? And this comes from a thread by Kamil Galeev, where he says that we're talking about a truce or even peace, but we should keep in mind that Russia won't be honoring it. Any ceasefire will be used for regrouping, restocking, and so on. Kamil Galeev is 100, not 99, 100% correct. From the beginning of the war, I've been emphasizing this turn in Putin's mind that consolidated itself around 2010 to 2012, which I've called Putin's civilizational turn. Putin developed a certain kind of sense of mission, a mission for Russia in historical time, and at the center of it is Putin himself. So there is a kind of a tying together of a mystical idea of collective self-realization for a people, and that's then tied to the will of a single individual. So it's very important to be clear that the preponderance of Western analysis of Russia is extravagantly naive about this. And I have no idea where the camera is in my phone, so I'm probably looking in the wrong place. But the preponderance of Western analysis takes us in the direction of thinking, well, the more defeats Putin suffers, the more he is going to question and potentially give up on his project. Not at all. Putin is more inflexibly committed to his mission today than he was on Feb 24. Yeah. So this is absolutely central. I'm going to do an episode on the main channel to bring this together for us and emphasize it, because it's still being largely misunderstood. Putin is less flexible now about his goals and aspirations than he was at the beginning of the war, not more flexible. Now, what do we derive in terms of pragmatic politics from this? We derive the idea that it is impossible for a sustainable deal to take place that's not predicated on Putin simply running out of capacity. Any bit of Ukraine that's not Putin's is for Putin a bit of Ukraine that's not yet been conquered, even if the conquering is going to happen 7 years from now. There is nothing, no piece of paper, no arrangement that could put this into question. So I completely agree with Kamil Galeev. Mycroft Montague asks, Vlad, I'm surprised that more people don't call this war a colonial war. What's your take? So I think that I have a very basic thing to say here, but short of saying that, I think the experts we tend to admire do recognize that it's a colonial war. But what I want to say here is something really, really important. It's not a colonial war of the kind that Russia would wage if it tried to invade Poland, because there you would have subjects and they could be conceived of as a colony potentially. That's not true with Ukraine, because Ukrainians are not people you want to colonize, they are your people in Putin's mind. Ukrainians are not some kind of second-rate culture that needs to be colonized. Ukrainians are not inferior or superior to Russians, they just are Russians for Putin. And the only reason they didn't realize that they're Russians is that a certain kind of very fake, unsustainable social formation, political order, social hysteria has developed on Ukrainian territory, sponsored by malign Western influences. And as soon as that fails to sustain itself, Ukrainians will wake up. If it takes a couple of generations and mass murder, Putin doesn't care. So that's how I'd qualify it. It's not a conventional kind of colonial enterprise, because for Putin, Ukrainians just are Russians. The last question is from Maria. Maria says, under the video about Russian apathy, one thing that struck me, and I'd love to hear your comment on this, is how similar this mindset you're describing appears to be with people inside abusive and narcissistic family structures and cults, the pervasive gaslighting, learned helplessness, magical thinking, and the belief that if you disagree, you will be alone, ostracized, and shunned. All that sounds very familiar. I think this is too much for me at the moment, because you would want to give a systematic picture of analogies and disanalogies, and that might require its own separate chat. And then temperamentally, I'm very slow to jump from psychoanalytic explanation to politics. 98.4% of the time when people do that jump, it doesn't work. But let me just sort of indirectly put one, maybe two things on the table that could help us. Now, imagine that we make up a couple of labels. Imagine that we talk about collective neurosis. And imagine that by collective neurosis we mean something like different items floating around in your mind being in a conflict or in an inadequate relationship that you cannot bear. So a common example of this that we often confront on our channel is the thought that people have that Western democracy is fine, it's just going to zigzag its way through and nothing is really wrong with it, it's always a self-correcting process. On the one hand. On the other hand, Western democracy is collapsing, it's dead, it's in terminal and imminent decline. And against these two thoughts, I gently recommend the image of, on the one hand, saying, yes, we're not going to be in the bay anymore, it's going to be bumpier than that, we're going to be out at sea in open water, but that doesn't mean we're going to sink. And so I'm trying to break people out of this neurotic loop of feeling everything is okay, it's all over, everything is okay, it's all over, and not knowing how to square these two pictures. So that's an example of neurotic, of collective neurosis, if you like. We are back. My phone died. Let's put a second thing on the table, and we might call that a psychotic collective pattern. And that's not when there are items in the mind, the relation of which feels unbearable, but rather when parts of the mind are segregated from one another. And imagine the mind as a house with several rooms just being closed off. Think about what the Putin regime is asking of its citizens. It's telling its citizens. It's saying, look, certain kinds of positive dispositions, like empathy or certain kinds of regard for the other, aren't actually real. They're not real in our enemies, but they're also not real in anybody, and they're not real in us. Because underneath these things there'll be various kinds of less lovely, more prudential processes that will be part of a rationalization that really explains how the world works and how we work. And there are plenty of disturbing elaborations of that thought that we can engage in, but to be brief, if this pattern goes very far, then the degree to which we'll be free to make more analogies than we're making at the moment with things that happen in the middle of the 20th century will change. To be even more inexcusably brief, let me just put something on the table without saying anything about it at all. And that's victim culture. The degree to which the political narrative being offered to Russian citizens is victimhood as identity is extraordinary. We've got to think about that, and we've got to watch for this, because historically, of course, victim identity movements have a capacity, when they're very, very heavily politicized and tied to the mission of a culture or a mission of a polity, be extraordinarily blind and destructive. And tying all of the meanderings we've just done, the worse all of this gets, the more Russia will need something akin to a process of denazification. Hope to be with you soon on the main channel, maybe in 2 or 3 days. Meanwhile, lots of love.